On a Tuesday morning in October of 1987, Emmett Hassel stood at the edge of a farm auction in Platte County, Nebraska, and watched a crowd of 200 people laugh at something that hadn't moved under its own power in 31 years. The machine in question was a 1938 Case Model L steam traction engine, or what was left of one. It sat at the far end of the auction line behind 3 rows of serviceable equipment: a working John Deere 444, 2 decent grain wagons, a hydraulic loader that still had its original paint, and it looked exactly like what most people in that crowd assumed it was: a relic, a curiosity, a very large, very orange, very dead piece of iron that someone's grandfather had dragged to the back of a barn in 1956 and never thought about again. The boiler was scaled. The firebox was cracked along the lower seam. One of the rear drive wheels had sunk 4 inches into the soft October ground, as if the earth itself had decided to begin reclaiming it. There was a hand-lettered tag tied to the throttle that read, "As is, no reserve," and the auctioneer had already told 2 separate people that he wasn't responsible for what it cost to haul it away. The crowd laughed because the opening bid was $50 and nobody raised a hand. Emmett Hassel raised his hand. Let me tell you about Emmett Hassel, because you need to understand the man before you can understand what he did next, and why it mattered, and why people in Platte County still talk about it the way they talk about weather events and election years. The kind of thing that becomes a fixed point in a community's memory, a before and after, a line you can draw through the middle of a decade. Emmett was 61 years old in the fall of 1987. He had farmed 320 acres in Platte County for 38 years, the same ground his father had broken in 1931, the same ground his grandfather had walked behind a horse team in 1903. The farm was not large by modern standards. It was not impressive by modern standards. What it was continuous. The same family, the same soil, the same understanding that the land was not yours to exploit, but yours to keep. Emmett had grown up understanding this the way he understood the smell of rain on dry ground or the sound a combine makes when the cylinder is running too fast. It was not knowledge he had acquired. It was knowledge he had absorbed. He was a short man, broad through the shoulders, with hands that looked like they had been carved from the same oak as his barn doors. He wore canvas work pants and a flannel shirt in every season, and his seed cap had the brim curved into a tight C from years of him gripping it and pulling it down against wind. He was not a man who complained. He was not a man who offered opinions unless someone asked, and sometimes not even then. His wife, Doris, had told their daughter once that Emmett could sit on the porch for 3 hours, watching a thunderstorm come in from the west, and never say a single word, and that she had learned over 40 years of marriage that this was not absence of thought. It was the opposite of absence of thought. It was thought so concentrated it had no need of words. What Emmett Hassel was, more than anything else, was a watcher. He watched equipment the way other men watched livestock, for signs of strain, for changes in gait, for the small signals that preceded big failures. He had taught himself to read a machine the way a doctor reads a patient, not by what it said, but by what it did. He had rebuilt 3 engines in his life from components, not from manuals. He had once diagnosed a cracked cylinder head on a neighbor's tractor by listening to the exhaust note from 40 feet away. He did not consider this remarkable. He considered it paying attention, and for 11 years, from 1976 to 1987, Emmett Hassel had been paying attention to a 1938 Case Model L. Let me tell you about that machine, because the machine is as much a character in this story as any person in it, and if you don't understand what it was built to do and why that mattered, you won't understand what happened on a cold November afternoon in 1987 when Emmett started the engine for the first time in front of an audience that had already decided it couldn't be done. The Case Model L was not a steam engine in the way most people picture steam engines. The great belching locomotives of the 19th century, all speed and spectacle. The Model L was a working machine, designed for one purpose and built to serve that purpose with absolute reliability. It produced 43 horsepower at the belt and 30 horsepower at the drawbar. It weighed, depending on configuration, somewhere between 18,000 and 20,000 pounds. It moved at a top speed of 3 miles per hour. It was not fast. It was not meant to be fast. What it was meant to be was inexorable. The kind of machine that, once it decided to move something, moved it. The kind of machine that did not recognize the concept of too heavy. The Case Model L was built during a period when American manufacturing still believed that the correct response to a difficult problem was not sophistication, but mass, not speed but torque, not complexity but simplicity applied at sufficient scale. It was a philosophy that the industry had largely abandoned by 1950, and which Emmett Hassel had never stopped believing in. He had first seen this particular machine in 1976, sitting in the back corner of a field belonging to a man named Orville Peterson, who had bought the Lundqvist place north of Columbus and was clearing out 3 generations of accumulated equipment. Emmett had gone to look at a PTO shaft and a set of cultivator shovels. He had found the Case L under a stand of box elder trees, buried to its axles in 11 years of leaf litter, its boiler jacket rusted to a deep uniform orange, its canopy gone, its whistle missing, its firebox open to the sky. Orville Peterson had told him it was worth nothing, and he could have it for the cost of hauling it out. Emmett had stood in front of it for a long time, the way Doris said he stood on the porch watching storms. Then he had said, "I'll be back with the lowboy on Saturday," and he had been. He spent 11 years on that machine. Not full-time. He had a farm to run, seasons to keep, a family to feed. But every winter, every wet spring day, every stretch of August when the crops were laid by and there was nothing left to do but wait, Emmett worked on the Case L. He rebuilt the firebox with new steel plate, hand-fitted to the original specifications he had found in a 1938 case service manual he had ordered from a collector in Decatur, Illinois. He descaled the boiler, using a method he had read about in a 1941 issue of Farm Mechanics magazine that someone had left at the county extension office. He sourced replacement injectors from a steam equipment salvage operation in Ames, Iowa. He fabricated the missing whistle from a photograph. He rebuilt the governor from components he machined himself on a metal lathe he had bought at an estate sale in 1962 and maintained with the same care he gave everything else he owned. Doris had asked him once, in the winter of 1983, why he was doing it. Not critically. She had long since stopped questioning what Emmett did in the shop, but genuinely curious, the way you're curious about something you have watched for years without fully understanding. Emmett had set down his file and thought about it for a moment. He had said, "Because it knows how to do something that everything else has forgotten." Doris had nodded as if this were a complete answer, because with Emmett it was. By the fall of 1987, the machine was not finished. But it was close. The boiler had been hydrostatically tested and held pressure. The firebox drew clean. The engine turned over by hand without binding. What it needed was a proper firing, a full operational test under load, and the kind of time Emmett had not yet found to give it. It sat in the back of his machine shed, covered with a canvas tarp, waiting. Then, in September of 1987, Emmett got a phone call from his neighbor Dale Crowley. Let me tell you about Dale Crowley, because Dale is the reason this story exists, and because understanding Dale Crowley requires understanding a particular kind of confidence that comes not from knowledge but from proximity to money. Dale Crowley was 44 years old, the owner of Crowley Excavation and Land Clearing, Platte County's largest such operation, and a man who had built his business on the simple principle that there was no earth-moving problem that could not be solved by applying sufficient horsepower. He drove a new 3/4-ton pickup every 2 years. He wore Carhartt that had never seen a full day's work. He was not a bad man. He was not a dishonest man. He was a man who had been right often enough, and loudly enough, that he had stopped being able to tell the difference between confidence and certainty. Dale Crowley had a problem. He had contracted to clear a 12-acre woodlot on the Sorensen place south of Humphrey, which the Sorensen family was converting to cropland. The contract had seemed straightforward in August. By September, it had become something else. The woodlot contained, at its center, 4 bur oak trees that the county extension agent estimated at between 150 and 200 years old. They were not large trees by the standards of the eastern forests, but they were bur oaks in Nebraska, which meant their root systems were not proportional to their height. They were proportional to 150 years of drought survival. The largest of the 4 had a trunk diameter of 52 inches, and a root system that, by the time Dale Crowley's crew began to understand what they were dealing with, appeared to extend in every direction for a radius of at least 40 feet, with primary roots running 14 to 18 feet deep. Dale had tried everything. He had brought in a Cat D8 dozer and pushed against the largest tree for 45 minutes before the blade began to show stress fractures in the mounting. He had used a hydraulic excavator with a root-cutting bucket to sever the surface roots, and then pushed again, and the tree had moved approximately 8 inches and then stopped, held by something deeper than the excavator could reach. He had brought in a stump grinder and spent 2 days reducing the visible root crown, and then pushed again, and the tree had not moved at all. He had, finally, in a moment of either inspiration or desperation, depending on your perspective, wrapped a logging chain around the trunk and attached it to 2 D8 dozers running in tandem, and the chain had snapped at 47,000 pounds of pull, with a sound like a rifle shot, and the tree had not moved. The Sorensen contract was worth $34,000. Dale Crowley had already spent $11,000 in equipment time and was no closer to a solution than he had been in August. He was also, and this was the part that was eating at him, being watched. The county road ran along the south edge of the Sorensen place, and for 3 weeks people had been slowing down to look. The feed store in Humphrey had heard about it. The co-op in Columbus had heard about it. Dale Crowley's inability to move 4 trees had become, in the way that only small county news can, a story. He called Emmett Hassel because Emmett's farm bordered the Sorensen place on the north, and because Dale had run out of people with modern equipment to call, and because someone at the co-op had mentioned, in the way people mention things they don't quite believe, that Emmett Hassel had been working on some kind of old steam machine out in his shed for the better part of a decade. Dale's exact words, as Emmett later told his son Gerald, were, "I heard you've got some kind of antique out there. I don't suppose it does anything useful." Emmett had said, "It might." Dale had said, "Well, I'm not paying for something that might." Emmett had said, "I'm not asking you to." Now, let me pause here and ask you something. Have you ever watched a man offer help to someone who doesn't want to admit they need it? There is a particular kind of silence that happens in those moments, a silence that contains the whole negotiation. The pride on one side, the patience on the other, the slow arithmetic of desperation working against stubbornness until one of them gives way. Dale Crowley was silent for a long moment on that phone. Then he said, "All right, come take a look." And Emmett, who had been waiting 11 years for a reason to fire that boiler, said, "I'll be there in the morning." He was there in the morning. He walked the woodlot in his canvas pants and his curved-brim seed cap, and he looked at the 4 trees and the torn ground around them and the broken chain that was still lying where it had fallen, and he did not say anything for a long time. Dale Crowley stood beside him with his arms crossed, and 2 of Dale's crew stood behind them, and everyone waited. Finally, Emmett crouched down next to one of the severed surface roots and looked at the cross-section of it, and he said, "You've been pulling up. The root system goes down and out. You've been trying to lift something that doesn't want to be lifted. You need to walk it out." Dale said, "Walk it out." Emmett said, "Slow pressure in a horizontal arc. Give the deep roots time to release instead of trying to snap them. Your dozers apply force too fast. They load the root system all at once and it locks up. You need something that builds pressure gradually and holds it." Dale looked at him for a moment. He said, "And your steam engine does that." Emmett said, "It does." The silence that followed was not the silence of consideration. It was the silence of a man deciding how to say no politely. Dale Crowley looked at his crew. One of them, a young man named Chad Thornton, who ran the excavator and had opinions about most things, made a sound that was not quite a laugh, but was in the same family. Dale looked back at Emmett and said, "Emmett, I appreciate you coming out here, but I've got 2 Cat D8S and a 345 excavator, and I can't move these trees. I don't think a machine that was built before World War II is going to do what 2 modern dozers couldn't." Emmett said, "Your dozers make horsepower. Mine makes torque. There's a difference." Dale said, "There's also a difference between a working machine and a museum piece." Chad Thornton laughed at that, not a cruel laugh. The laugh of a young man who has not yet learned that the things he finds funny are sometimes the things that will instruct him most thoroughly. It was a short, certain laugh, the kind that closes a conversation rather than continuing it. Dale's other crew member, an older man who had been quiet throughout, looked at the ground. Emmett did not respond to the laugh. He looked at the largest tree one more time, and then he looked at Dale, and he said, "I'll bring it over Thursday morning. If it doesn't work, it costs you nothing, and I'll help you load the chain." Dale started to say something and then stopped, because there was nothing to say to that, and because $11,000 of failed attempts had removed most of his negotiating position. He said, "Fine, Thursday morning. Let me tell you about the Thursday morning, because it is the reason this story is still being told, and because what happened between 7 in the morning and 2:30 in the afternoon on November 12th, 1987, is one of those events that people who were present describe differently, depending on how close they were standing and how much they understood about what they were watching, but agree on completely in terms of how it made them feel. Emmett arrived at 6:45 with the Case L on a lowboy trailer pulled by his farm truck, and the first thing that happened was that Dale Crowley's crew stopped what they were doing and looked at it. It was not what they had expected. They had expected something small and quaint and obviously inadequate, the kind of thing you see at a county fair next to a butter churn and a spinning wheel. What they saw instead was a machine that weighed 19,000 pounds and stood 11 feet tall at the top of its canopy frame, painted in Case's original flint gray with the eagle decal on the side panel that Emmett had reproduced from a period photograph. Its brass fittings catching the low November light, its boiler jacket smooth and tight, its drive wheels, each one 5 feet in diameter, sitting on the trailer with the patient gravity of something that had never been in a hurry and never needed to be. Chad Thornton looked at it and said, "Huh." The older crew member, whose name was Vernon, said nothing. He walked over to the trailer and looked at the front axle and the steering chain and the firebox door, and then he stepped back and looked at the whole machine, and his expression was the expression of a man recalibrating something he thought he already understood. It took Emmett 45 minutes to unload the machine and position it. He did not rush. He checked the water level in the boiler, opened the firebox, and began building the fire with a combination of dry hardwood and coal that he had loaded in the truck bed, and while the fire built, he walked the woodlot one more time and decided on his approach angle to the largest tree. Dale Crowley watched all of this with the expression of a man who has agreed to something he is not sure about and is now committed to seeing it through. His crew watched with the expression of men who are waiting for something to fail in an interesting way. The boiler took an hour and 20 minutes to reach working pressure. During that time, Emmett did nothing dramatic. He monitored the pressure gauge. He adjusted the draft. He checked the injector. He walked around the machine twice, touching things, listening the way he had always listened to machines. Not for what they said, but for what they didn't say, for the absence of the sounds that meant something was wrong. The crew drifted. Dale Crowley checked his watch twice. Chad Thornton sat on the excavator and ate a sandwich. At 8:55, the pressure gauge reached 150 pounds per square inch, and Emmett Hassel opened the throttle. Let me tell you about what happened next, because the sequence of it matters, and because people who tell this story sometimes compress it into a single dramatic moment, which is wrong. It was not a single moment. It was a series of moments, each one slightly more impossible than the last, building toward something that none of the people standing in that woodlot had a category for. The engine sound, when Emmett opened the throttle, was not the sound any of them had expected. It was not the chuffing cartoon sound of a fairground steam engine. It was deep and rhythmic and authoritative, a sound that seemed to come from somewhere below the ground rather than above it, a sound that you felt in your sternum before you heard it with your ears. Vernon, the older crew member, stood up straighter when he heard it. Chad Thornton stopped chewing. Emmett had rigged a block and tackle arrangement from the Case L's drawbar to a heavy logging chain wrapped around the base of the largest bur oak, with the chain angle set deliberately low and horizontal, almost parallel to the ground. Not pulling up, not pulling straight back. Pulling in a slow arc, the way you walk a fence post out of frozen ground. Not by jerking it, but by working it side to side, slow and steady, letting the soil release rather than demanding it release all at once. He had explained this to Dale before he started. Dale had nodded without fully believing it. The chain came taut at 9:03. Not with a snap, not with the sudden shock load that had broken the previous chain, but gradually, the way a muscle comes taut when you lean into something with your full weight. The Case L's drive wheels, 5 feet of cast iron and steel, pressed into the November ground and gripped it, and the machine settled into its work the way a draft horse settles into a collar, not with drama, but with a kind of total commitment that made drama unnecessary. For the first 4 minutes, nothing visible happened. The chain was taut. The engine was running. The tree was not moving. Dale Crowley looked at his watch. Chad Thornton had gotten down from the excavator and was standing with his arms crossed, and his expression had recovered some of its earlier certainty. Vernon was watching the base of the tree. At 9:07, Vernon said quietly, "There." Nobody else had seen it. But Vernon had been watching the right place. At the base of the trunk, on the side opposite the chain, a hairline crack had opened in the soil. Not a dramatic heave. A crack, maybe 1/8 of an inch wide, running in a slight arc around the root crown. Emmett saw it too. He made a small adjustment to the throttle. Not more power, but a slight change in the rhythm of the pull, a barely perceptible variation in the pressure that he later described to Gerald as giving the roots time to think about it. At 9:11, the crack was 1/4 inch wide. At 9:14, it was 1 inch. At 9:17, the ground around the base of the tree made a sound. It was not a loud sound. It was a low, tearing sound, the sound of something that had held for 1.5 centuries, deciding, finally, that it was done holding. Dale Crowley took a step backward without meaning to. Chad Thornton uncrossed his arms. At 9:22, with a sound that everyone present would later describe differently, a groan, a crack, a deep concussion, a sound like a door closing in a very large, empty house. The root system of the largest bur oak began to move. Not all at once, not with the sudden violence of the snapped chain. It moved the way a ship moves when it leaves a dock, slowly, massively, with the kind of momentum that, once started, does not stop. The trunk tilted 2 degrees, then 4, then the ground on the pull side erupted in a slow wave, a ripple of earth moving outward from the base as root after root released its grip, each one with its own small sound, and the tree came over in a long, deliberate arc and lay down on the November ground with a final impact that everyone felt through the soles of their boots. The root ball that came with it was 11 feet across and 7 feet deep. It had been in that ground since approximately 1790. The crew did not cheer immediately. There was a moment of silence first. The kind of silence that follows something that has exceeded what people were prepared for, a silence of recalibration. Then Vernon made a sound that was not quite a word, and Dale Crowley sat down on a log and put his hands on his knees, and Chad Thornton said out loud, to no one in particular, what in the and did not finish the sentence. Emmett Hassel shut down the throttle, walked the chain to the fallen tree, unhooked it, and began repositioning for the second tree. He had the woodlot cleared by 2:30 that afternoon. Let me tell you about what Dale Crowley did the next morning, because it is the part of this story that matters most, and because it is the part that Emmett Hassel told least often, which is how you know it meant the most to him. Dale Crowley drove up Emmett's Lane at 7:15 on a Friday morning, which was early even by farm standards, and knocked on the back door. Doris let him in and poured him coffee without being asked, because that is what you did, and Dale sat at the kitchen table with the coffee and waited for Emmett to come in from the barn. When Emmett came in and washed his hands at the sink and sat down across from Dale, Dale looked at his coffee cup for a moment and then looked up and said, "I owe you an explanation and probably an apology." Emmett said, "You don't owe me either one." Dale said, "I told you it was a museum piece." Emmett said, "It is a museum piece. It's also a working machine. Those aren't opposites." Dale was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "How did you know it would work? How did you know the angle, the pressure, all of it?" Emmett poured himself coffee and sat back in his chair. He said, I didn't know it would work. I knew why it should work, which is a different thing. Your machines are designed to protect themselves. They have relief valves, pressure limits, automatic cutoffs. They're built for a world where the operator might not be paying attention. The Case L doesn't have any of that. It has a throttle and a pressure gauge, and whatever judgment the man running it brings to the job. It doesn't stop because it's uncomfortable. It stops when you tell it to stop. That's not a limitation. That's a capability. Dale said, I spent $11,000 before I called you. Emmett said, I know. Dale said, I would have spent $11,000 more if you hadn't come over. Emmett said, I know that too. Dale reached into his jacket pocket and put an envelope on the table. He said, There's $3,000 in there. I know you said you weren't asking for payment, but I'm asking you to take it. Emmett looked at the envelope and then looked at Dale and said, Give it to the County Historical Society. They're trying to restore the Platte County Fairgrounds barn, and they're about $4,000 short. Dale said he would do that. He did do that, as it turned out. The check arrived at the Historical Society the following week, and the barn restoration was completed the following spring, and nobody at the Historical Society knew for several years where the money had come from. Dale Crowley did not become a different man overnight. That is not how it works, and this story does not pretend otherwise. But in the years that followed, people who worked with Dale noticed certain changes. He began keeping older equipment longer instead of trading it at the first sign of wear. He started asking questions before he started engines, which had not always been his habit. He hired Vernon, the older crew member, as his equipment manager, a position that had not previously existed at Crowley Excavation, and gave him authority over maintenance decisions that Dale had previously made himself. Whether these changes came from that November morning in the woodlot or from other experiences accumulated over time, nobody could say for certain. But Vernon, who had watched the whole thing from 6 feet away, had his own opinion about it, and he kept it to himself the way men of his generation kept most things that mattered. Let me tell you about the Case L in the years that followed, because the machine's story did not end in that woodlot, and because what happened to it over the next 2 decades is in some ways more remarkable than what happened on the day that made it famous. Word traveled, as it does in small counties, and by the spring of 1988, Emmett had been asked to bring the Case L to 3 different jobs: a land clearing operation in Colfax County, a tree removal project at a farmstead in Platte County that had been in the same family since 1899 and contained oaks nearly as old as the Sorensen trees, and a drainage project on a farm north of Columbus where a contractor had tried and failed to remove a series of root masses that were blocking a new tile line. Emmett went to all 3. He did not charge for any of them. He accepted fuel costs and sometimes a meal, and he went home. Doris told their daughter that she thought he was doing it because the machine needed to be used, the way a good horse needs to be ridden, not for the destination, but for the doing of it. In 1991, Emmett was invited to bring the Case L to the Platte County Steam and Gas Show, which was held every August at the county fairgrounds. He went. He demonstrated the engine under load, pulling a weighted sled in front of an audience of about 300 people. And the response was what it had been in the woodlot. First silence, then something that was not quite cheering but was in that direction. The sound of people who have seen something they did not know they needed to see. A man from the Nebraska State Historical Society was in the audience that day and asked Emmett afterward if the machine had been documented. Emmett said he didn't know what that meant. The man explained. Emmett said, It's documented in my head and in a 1938 case service manual and in about 40 notebooks in my shop. The man from the Historical Society said that would do. Emmett Hassel died in March of 2003 at the age of 76 from a heart attack he had in the machine shed on a Wednesday morning, which was where Doris had always expected it would happen, and which Emmett, she said later, would have considered a reasonable place to go. He had been working on the governor of the Case-L, making an adjustment he had been meaning to make for 2 years. The adjustment was not finished. Gerald finished it that summer, following the notes his father had left in one of the 40 notebooks, and the governor ran correctly from that point forward. The funeral was held at the Lutheran Church in Humphrey, and the attendance was larger than anyone had expected for a man who had lived quietly on 320 acres and never sought attention. Dale Crowley was there. Vernon was there. Chad Thornton, who was by then running his own small excavation business and had developed over the years a habit of asking questions before he started engines, was there. The man from the Nebraska State Historical Society sent a letter that Gerald read at the graveside. The letter said, among other things, that Emmett Hassel had understood something about mechanical inheritance that most of his generation had let go of, and that the county was richer for his having held on to it. Gerald Hassel was 41 when his father died, and had farmed alongside him for 20 years, and had watched the Case-L story unfold from its beginning with the quiet attention of a man who had been raised to watch carefully. He was not his father in temperament. He was more talkative, more willing to explain himself, less comfortable with long silences. But he had inherited the essential thing, which was the understanding that a tool is not just a tool, but a repository of the thinking that built it, and that discarding a tool because it is old is the same as discarding the thinking, which may be the only thing that was right about the problem you're trying to solve. Gerald kept the Case-L in the machine shed under the same canvas tarp his father had used, and he maintained it the way his father had maintained it, not as a museum piece, though it was that, but as a working machine, because his father had taught him that the distinction was false. He fired it twice a year, once in spring and once in fall, to keep the boiler seals conditioned and the engine free. He kept the notebooks, he kept the service manual, he kept the 40 notebooks his father had filled over 11 years of restoration work, and he added his own. In the summer of 2019, Gerald's son Marcus, who was 23, had studied agricultural mechanics at the University of Nebraska and had his grandfather's hands and his father's willingness to explain himself, came home from a job in Colfax County, where a land-clearing contractor had spent 3 days trying to remove a stand of old bur oaks from a farm that was converting to row crops and had failed, and was now looking for alternatives. Marcus had watched the contractor work for most of the second day before driving home. He walked into the machine shed and stood in front of the Case-L for a while, the way his grandfather used to stand on the porch watching storms. Then he found Gerald in the shop and said, "Dad, I think it's time to fire it up." Gerald looked at him for a moment. He said, "I'll get the coal. Let me tell you about what happened in Colfax County, because the story does not end with Emmett, and it does not end with Gerald, and because what Marcus Hassel did on a September afternoon in 2019 was not a repetition of what his grandfather had done in 1987. It was a confirmation, which is a different and in some ways more important thing. A repetition says it happened once. A confirmation says it is true. The contractor in Colfax County was a man named Brett Prescott, 38 years old, who ran a modern land clearing operation with a GP, S-equipped Cat D10 and a forestry mulcher that cost $280,000 and could reduce a 6-inch tree to chips in 45 seconds. The bur oaks he was trying to remove were not 6 inches. They were between 40 and 58 inches at the base, and their root systems had the same character as the Sorensen trees. Deep, wide, interlocked, built for a century and a half of drought survival. Brett Prescott had bent the mulcher's cutting head on the second tree and had been working with the D10 alone since then, with results that were, by the time Marcus arrived, essentially identical to what Dale Crowley had achieved with his dozers 32 years earlier. Marcus introduced himself and explained what he had. Brett Prescott looked at him. 23 years old, university jacket, no visible equipment, and said, with the particular patience of a man who is trying to be polite about something he finds absurd, that he appreciated the offer, but he had $400,000 worth of equipment on site, and he didn't think a steam tractor was going to solve a problem that a D10 couldn't. Marcus said, "It's not a tractor, it's a traction engine, and it's not about power, it's about how you apply it." Brett Prescott said, "Son, I've been clearing land for 15 years. Marcus said, "I know. My grandfather cleared the Sorensen woodlot in Platte County in 1987. 4 bur oaks, the largest was 52 inches. He was done by 2:30 in the afternoon. If you want, I can give you the name of the man who hired him. He's retired now, but he still answers his phone." Brett Prescott looked at Marcus for a long moment. Then he looked at the D10 and the bent mulcher head. Then he said, "All right, bring it out." The Case L arrived on a lowboy the next morning, driven by Gerald, with Marcus riding in the truck. Brett Prescott's crew, 4 men, all of them younger than Marcus, all of them with modern equipment certifications and very little experience with anything built before 1980, watched it come off the trailer with the same expression that Dale Crowley's crew had worn in 1987. The same recalibration, the same revision of expectations. One of them, a young man who reminded Gerald strongly of Chad Thornton, said, "Is that thing actually going to run?" Gerald said, "It's been running since 1938. It'll run today." Marcus fired the boiler. Gerald watched. The crew watched. Brett Prescott watched with his arms crossed and his expression carefully neutral, the expression of a man who has agreed to something and is now managing his expectations. The boiler took an hour and 20 minutes to reach pressure, the same as it always had, because the Case L did not hurry for anyone. When Marcus opened the throttle, the sound hit Brett Prescott's crew the same way it had hit Dale Crowley's crew. In the sternum first, then in the ears, deep and rhythmic and absolutely certain of itself. The young man who had asked if it would run said nothing. He just stood there. The first tree came down in 41 minutes. The root ball was 9 feet across. The crew was silent for a moment, and then the young man who had said nothing made a sound that was not quite a word, but communicated everything that needed to be communicated. Brett Prescott uncrossed his arms. He walked over to where Gerald was standing and watched Marcus work the chain setup for the second tree, and after a while he said, "How does he know the angle?" Gerald said his grandfather wrote it down, and then his father, and then he read it, and then he went out and practiced it. Brett Prescott said, "The machine's what, 80 years old?" Gerald said, 81, built in Racine, Wisconsin, 1938. My father bought it in 1976 for the cost of hauling it out of a field. Spent 11 years restoring it. Used it for the first time in November of 1987. We've used it maybe 30 times since then, Brett Prescott said, 30 times in 32 years. Gerald said, it doesn't get called often, but when it gets called, there's usually a reason. They had the woodlot cleared by 3 o'clock. Marcus drove the Case L back onto the lowboy himself, and Gerald watched him do it with the expression of a man who's watching something he built being used correctly, which is the best feeling available to a person who builds things. On the drive home, Gerald asked Marcus what he was thinking about. Marcus said he was thinking about a piece he had read in a university journal about the root architecture of old-growth trees and how it related to soil compaction, and whether there was a way to map root systems before you started clearing so you could choose your approach angle before you hooked the chain. Gerald said, write it down. Marcus said he already had. The Case L is in the machine shed on the Hassel farm north of Columbus, Nebraska, under the same canvas tarp that Emmett Hassel put over it in the winter of 1988, though it has been replaced twice since then. It is fired twice a year, in spring and in fall. The boiler holds pressure. The firebox draws clean. The governor, which Gerald finished adjusting in the summer of 2003 following his father's notes, runs correctly. The 40 notebooks are in a cabinet in the shop, along with Gerald's additions and Marcus's additions, and the 1938 Case Service Manual that Emmett ordered from a collector in Decatur, Illinois, is in a plastic sleeve in the top drawer. Still readable, still accurate, still the document that started everything. The Nebraska State Historical Society has asked twice about donating the machine to a museum. Gerald has declined both times, politely, with the same explanation. It's a working machine. Museums are for things that have stopped working. This one hasn't. Brett Prescott called Gerald in the spring of 2020 and asked if Marcus would be available for a land clearing job in Dodge County. Gerald said he would ask. Marcus said yes. Some things don't become obsolete. They just wait for people to remember why they were built. Emmett Hassel understood this in 1976 when he stood in front of a rusted machine buried in leaf litter and said, "I'll be back with a lowboy on Saturday." Gerald understood it in 2003 when he finished his father's adjustment and heard the governor run clean for the first time. Marcus understood it in 2019 when he stood in a Colfax County woodlot and said, "It's not about power. It's about how you apply it." The Case L understood it all along. That's what happens when you build something to do one thing and you build it well enough that it never forgets how to do it. And the people who inherit it never forget either. And the problems that require it never entirely go